All right. Okay. I'd like to start with a quote from Sigmund Freud, who said, "A personal God is, psychologically, nothing other than an exalted Father. The almighty and just God and kindly nature appear to us as grand sublimations of Father and Mother, or rather as revivals and restorations of young child's ideas of them." At the beginning of the 20th century, psychoanalysis began as a one-man operation with many adherents. Initially, Sigmund Freud's avowed atheism, and he strongly attacked religion, calling it a product of childhood neuroses that must sooner or later be renounced. This attack obviously provoked many tensions for Christians. Overall, Christianity's reception has ranged from acceptance or distant regard to vitriol. It began by providing I will begin by providing some background on Freud's own development as he grew up that seems to have influenced his anti-religious formation. So we're going to go into this question, why did Freud reject God? Sigmund Freud linked human representations of God to the father figure, connecting religious feelings and experiences with attachments to father exemplified his view that developmental processes condition religious belief. And in fact, I'll go off script, sometimes that has been demonstrated. We do have a filter from our human experience of ways we see God that is different than theology. Other factors possibly contributing to his atheism include Freud's view of science and conviction that to be scientific, psychoanalysis must be atheistic. Freud's ambivalence and attraction to Christianity, you might be surprised, and other complex factors around his Jewish inheritance, including anti-Semitism and supersessionism, but also, surprisingly, his honesty and humility. Sigmund Freud was the first child of his mother, Amelie, and received her central attention for just 8 months. In his perception, she was an egocentric parent. Remarks in his writings appear to attest how he coped by distancing himself from her, a strategy that could potentially contribute to an emotionally unavailable God image. Thereafter, he became very close to his nurse, who, according to Freud, became his primary originator. I'm looking around because there's something I'm going to say here. And by initiating him in sexual matters. She told him about God and took him to a Roman Catholic church. She was Czechoslovakian. After church, he would play at imitating the priest and perform sermons. This is Freud. All right? For Freud, his nurse became his primary sexual object in his childlike way, and he connected living or life with her and linked his mother to death. However, while he was quite young, his nurse was abruptly removed from his home, and young Sigmund fell into despair. He felt lost without her nurturance. Perhaps linking one God image to this loss, he wrote, "We naturally feel hurt that a just God and a kindly providence do not protect us better from such influences during the most defenseless period of our lives." In turn, Freud turned to his father only too soon to be disappointed. Because his father, Jacob, was unable to support the family, they moved to a large town, which happened to be Vienna, and lived in poverty. However, during this latency stage, his father taught him biblical stories that left a lasting impression on him. It is unclear what resulted from this part of their relationship. Further, Sigmund's favorite uncle, Joseph, was convicted for dealing in counterfeit rubles. As surmised by Anna Marie Rizzuto, quote, "The men in the family could offer neither protection nor integrity," end quote. Further, Freud became pressed into a role of taking care of his family. To summarize Rizzuto's detailed analysis, detailed in an entire book and formulations from Freud's unbelief, 1, he felt his family's affection for him and attachment to him, but he also felt forced into a role of caretaking for them, foregoing the freedoms of childhood. In modern terms, he became a parentified child who could not count on his family, but he had to be there for them. 2, God had lost his power for Freud. He grew accustomed to a reversal of roles that made God irrelevant and Sigmund in charge. He stated that God was a nothing and a being that does not deserve his attention. As Freud formulated, those are quotes, by the way, from his writings. As Freud formulated his own view of God, evolved around his relationship with his father, who he also demoted. And then through displacement, God was made to pay for the failure of all his primary objects. Objects meaning his relationships. He saw it was his destiny, this is number 3, to be the grand revealer of nature's secrets, taking God's place and at the same time protecting him from feeling any helplessness which he abhorred, and by enacting his love of independence. I'd like you to bookmark that word helplessness along with the losses that we are learning about from his life. There are many more, but I've had to shorten it for this talk. Freud, in his view of what is to be a scientist, demanded that men grow up and face the world alone without what he called the infantile crutch of an all-exalted Father God. For, with the death of his father, the feelings of terror and helplessness triggered feelings of loss of his beloved nurse and rekindled his despair. The collision between religion and psychoanalysis began with Freud's attack on religion as illusion. These attacks, with their rejection of God, may be seen as a symptom of his own illness. In supplanting God and replacing belief with his own ideology, he likely took psychoanalysis down an unnecessary sidetrack. Carl Jung reports Freud saying, quote, "My dear Jung, promise me never to abandon the sexual theory," Freud's theory. "That is the most important thing of all. You see, we must make a dogma out of it, an unshakable bulwark," end of the quote. Freud's powerful sublimation of his very painful issues were a part of his creation of psychoanalysis, but seems to have made him unable to submit to his own prescribed treatment. As an architect of psychoanalysis, he strongly defended his authority. When Jung, in an attempt to help interpret one of Freud's dreams, asked for personal details from his life, Freud reportedly looked at Jung with suspicion and said, "But I cannot risk my authority." He never could submit himself to what he saw as the dreaded transference and regression to dependency, described so well by Winnicott, the method of psychoanalysis, to go back. We can speculate that Freud was terrified that analysis could bring the daunting prospect of accessing painful losses and rage. Also, as the god of his own private religion, he never seemed able to submit to another authority, another psychoanalyst. Consistent with Rizzuto's formulation, Carl Jung related that, quote, "Although I did not properly understand it then, I had observed in Freud the eruption of unconscious religious factors. Evidently, he wanted my aid in erecting a barrier against these threatening unconscious contents." End of quote. Although psychoanalysis has largely moved from a pervasive view of religion as an obsessional neurosis, we can still pause and reflect on which unconscious barriers we may impose on ourselves and God to a more authentic and dependent relationship with God. This is taken from my writing, my book. Embracing this question might promote a view of psychoanalysis and religion supporting each other, both for the sake of the patient and for the mutual benefit of their respective endeavors. Let us now turn to a description of the various Christian responses to Freud and later forms of psychoanalysis. The Roman Catholic response. Because of Freud's referring to religion as an illusion, Roman Catholics instantly reacted negatively, even before reading his works. Psychoanalysis and Catholicism have been at odds with each other for a long time, yet while they disagree on most every possible issue, they are inseparably united in their effort to help man understand himself. The adversarial nature of the relationship has dissipated over time between analysis and the Roman Catholics, in part because some psychoanalysts, as both converts and priests, are Roman Catholic believers. The papal response has largely been restrained, although Pope Pius XII rejected the, quote, pansexualist theory of a certain psychoanalytic school, end quote, but adds that, quote, psychology of the text does not condemn it when it discovers the contents of the religious psyche, end quote. Pope Pius XII added his wishes that the quote, spiritual values be taken into consideration by both the psychologist and his patients, end quote. In recent history, Roman Catholics have been more forgiving of Freud. For instance, they point out that Freud was careful to say an illusion is not the same thing as an error, but that when a belief has become a wish fulfillment and as such acts as a prominent factor in motivation, it therefore becomes an illusion, but not proof that religion is false. Further, contemporary Catholic perspectives often see psychoanalysis as concerned with matters of the soul, whereas religion is now seen to be concerned with the spiritual welfare of the whole man, but specifically the soul in whose essence grace resides. Roman Catholic priests have now been granted permission to become psychoanalysts, and it has been recommended that psychoanalysis be used to assist with both the screening of priests and promotion of psychological welfare of priests. Overall, the view of Catholicism, while more varied than expressed here, accepts that its own teachings, such as those of St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote about both the need for the soul to address anxieties and that the soul is a source of both love and hate, which may be unconscious, and predate Freud. Let's move now to the Protestant response. As might be expected, the Protestant response has been almost as broad and varied as the hundreds of denominations that have proliferated since the time of Martin Luther. Therefore, it is difficult to characterize the response of these many movements. While equally offended at Freud's apparent attacks on them, a growing sympathy with psychoanalytic ideas has emerged over the last 100 or more years. The varying Protestant faiths have written extensively in response to psychoanalysis and have found psychology and religion founded psychology and religion peer journals, multiple organizations to facilitate dialogues between psychology, psychoanalysis, and Christianity. Most writings by Protestants seem to adopt the pragmatic, rationalistic, as well as cataphatic theological approaches. Largely focused on integrating psychology and faith, these approaches appear to be influenced by the Hegelian dialect thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Going off script for a moment, as you know, when you do that, it provides an interesting result, but it waters down both when you don't keep it in dialogue. Within the limitations that integration and synthesis brings, Protestants nevertheless flexibly adapt religious formulations and psychoanalysis to attachment-oriented therapies, marital therapy, brief psychodynamic psychotherapy, contemporary psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and other modern relational approaches that include object relations and self-psychology. It is important to stop here, though, and recognize the ever-pragmatic Protestant Anglican theologian C.S. Lewis, whose writings appear to transcend denominational boundaries, speaks of Freud and psychoanalysis this way. When Freud is talking about how to cure neurotics, he is speaking as a specialist on his own subject. But when he goes on to talk general philosophy, he is speaking as an amateur. But psychoanalysis itself, apart from all the philosophical additions that Freud and others have made it to it, is not in the least contradictory to Christianity. Its technique overlaps with Christian morality at some points, and it would not be a bad thing if every parson knew. Now that psychoanalysis undertakes to do what psychoanalysis undertakes to do is to remove abnormal feelings, that is, to give man a better raw material for his acts of choice. Morality is concerned with the acts of choice themselves. Now, this difference is purely a moral one, and psychoanalysis cannot do anything about it. However much you improve the man's raw material, you still have something else, the real free choice of man on the material presented to him, either to put his own advantage first or to put it last. And this free choice is the only thing that morality is concerned with. The bad psychological material is not a sin, but a disease. It does not need to be repented of, but to be cured. Human beings judge one another by external actions. God judges them by their moral choices. Now, this difference is purely a moral one, and psychoanalysis cannot do anything about it. Last but not least, I will attempt to outline an Orthodox approach or response. Although Orthodox authorities and writers obviously reject the notion of religion as an illusion, they have made efforts to place psychoanalysis and religion into meaningful dialogue. Some writers appear to present them as competitors of the truth rather than keeping them in dialogue, discounting psychoanalysis's theological shortcomings. A now classic work by Archimandrite Hierotheos Vlachos, his work called Orthodox Psychotherapy, is a great account of the healing of the Church and what sacraments she offers, but does seem to dismiss psychotherapy and credit all emotional healing and put it to the Church. Characteristically, Orthodox writers and theologians do not submit to Hegelian dialect, which runs the risks of diminishing both disciplines in the end. Further, this approach can result in psychologizing religion or converting psychology into some kind of secular faith. The Orthodox Church, by maintaining its position that the ontological truth and teachings of the Church, as laid down by Christ and his apostles, are immutable, has potentially positioned herself to not feel threatened and to adopt those applications of truth flowing from psychoanalysis that may aid the Christian. In the United States, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion was founded in part for dialogues of psychology and faith. Although it has been difficult for me to put together an organized view of the Orthodox response, many Orthodox writers, here goes, Father Vasileios Themos, Petar Yeveromovic, Father Nikolaos Ladabikos, Father Christomos Timpos, Father Stephen Muse, Demetrios Kyriazius, and this is my favorite one, Konstantinos Emmanuelides, and Athanasios Alexandridis, to name a few, are addressing this dialogue. Off script again. Father Vasileios is going to give me a tutorial in these names when I arrive in Greece. Okay. Also, the North American Serbian Orthodox Church sponsored an institute to promote psychology in the service of the Church, which has increased the focus on this dialogue. Thus, the momentum and fervor for dialogue between psychoanalysis and orthodoxy seems to be growing. There may be many other organizations, journals, and discussions going on. Perhaps it would be helpful to have an international association if we do not have one. When reviewing other Christian literature, there is very little mention of the Orthodox contribution to this dialogue in the world of psychology itself. It is not clear whether this is a reflection of a kind of Orthodox isolation or its diversified jurisdictions in the Patriarchate or some other factor. This seems to be a matter for both clarity and further exploration. In sum, several Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox psychoanalysts have dissented from Freud's view on religion. Among the most significant were contemporaries who challenged Freud, namely the Christian Swiss psychoanalyst Oskar Pfister, and I think he's from Ukraine, maybe Gregory Zilborg, each who saw very little conflict between Christianity and psychoanalysis. Off script again, Freud even invited Oskar Pfister to his home all the time. They were very good friends. He's a Christian psychoanalyst. So it's an interesting backstory. Clearly, across the Christian world, psychoanalytic thought has persisted because it has not thrown out the Freudian baby with the bathwater. Let us turn this discussion to the hurdles that must be crossed to improve the dialogue between psychoanalysis and religion. For the sake of the brevity of this presentation, I would like to summarize some key barriers that have created tensions between psychoanalysis and religion. One is that psychoanalysis is not religious, a religion, or theological in nature. It doesn't offer theological answers. Two is the problem of Freud's atheism. Three, psychoanalysis' emphasis on the mind, sometimes to the point of making the mind a religious object of devotion. As an example, early adherents were excommunicated for not agreeing with Freud. And four, certain psychoanalytic thinkers see autonomy, self-sufficiency, and self-fulfillment as the goal of psychoanalysis, again, without any apparent theological, ontological base or reliance on God. These barriers of lack of ontology, atheism, intolerance, and self-sufficiency, for example, there's no need to rely on a God, can restrict meaningful dialogue. The reader will note that these criticisms or limitations are all based on the side of the relative newcomer, psychoanalysis. I was supposed to say reader. The Christian religion was in place long before psychoanalysis and presents with its own inherent ontology, which begins with the existence of God, sees the mind within the context of a greater whole, and is based on relationship versus individualism. These barriers became points to address in dialogue to see if any shifts in analytic thinking can encourage this discussion. With this in mind, I will trace a major strand of thinking within psychoanalysis that offers this potential. I will weave together a brief narrative that traces a seismic shift in psychoanalytic theorizing that that opened promising doors for dialogue with the Church. With one statement, W.R.D. Fairbairn effected a major shift in analytic thinking. The quote is, "Libidinal aims are secondary of importance in comparison with object relations. A relationship with an object, not the gratifications of an impulse, is the ultimate aim of libidinal striving." Translated, relationships are more important than sexual drive. With this injunction and the following that eventually ensued, personality became based on its organization around navigation of relationships. What this emphasis means is that while humans are driven towards relationships, they also, through transference, recreate their internalized object relationships, often in ways that painfully limit current relational needs. For example, individuals can tend to attach to bad objects, as we might say today, unhealthy relationships, and the task of analysis is to dissolve this harmful tendency. Not only do relationships play out in the transference, but also in the formation and maintenance of deeply seated defensive stances. During the same time, Melanie Klein, working to write about infantile and later experiences of helplessness in the face of dependencies on the object, would extend her theorizing about primitive positions, namely the paranoid schizoid and depressive positions. These fancy terms have to do with the defenseless child and later adult who utilizes defenses to form feelings of persecution and self-sufficient withdrawal from relationships, which includes denial of needing others and fantasies of being attacked if we do. As Harry Guntrip, the British minister and later psychoanalysis would later detail, this unsustainable emotional and relational deprivation would require resolution. The resolution, according to Melanie Klein, is the depressive position, which involves a recognition of the need of other and required gestures of repair. By making relationships more central, the potential for dialogue between psychoanalysis and religion has been enhanced. I can't resist the temptation to say something about this requiring repair, or if we were to put it in theological language, forgiveness. And very often, we experience traumatic experiences with each other. We hurt each other, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally. But when I ask my patients over again what would be worse, to go through a traumatic experience with someone or to never be able to repair it, to never to be able to repair the relationship, to never have forgiveness, the answer is always the latter. Bad experiences are hard and we don't want them. but it's worse to never be able to make it better and repair. And that's what we're trying to do after the fall, is repair our relationship with God. By making relationships central, this has now increased our dialogue with psychoanalysis. Donald Winnicott underscores this relationship emphasis and links it to the issue of authenticity. In his penetrating and intricate analysis of the mother-child relationship, he brought the fundamental struggle for human development into focus with his pronouncement, "There is no such thing as a baby without a mother." That may sound strange, but when you think of John 15:5, without, let's see, how does it go again? "Apart from me, you can do nothing." It's this interesting parallel between the child and the parent, and God, the great parent, and our dependency on him. Winnicott is characterizing a fundamental problem in human relationships that is of tremendous concern for the Christian, namely our dependency on God and theosis. In his now classic Fear of Breakdown paper, he offers a perspective on how traumatic, painful misattunement in the parent-child dyad can be. Because of this powerful fear, the child constructs a false self-personality to both accommodate and preserve the dependency on the caretaker, but in so doing, significantly compromises authentic relating. This way of coping underscores a critical avenue of dialogue with faith, and that of authentically relating to God. Another side note, Winnicott was the famous psychologist who, instead of wanting mothers or fathers, parents to be perfect, formulated the idea of the good enough mother. A relief to many, many parents around the world. Not that we have to take all of our advice from the psychoanalyst, but it's important. Okay. The necessity of relationships was extended further by Heinz Kohut, who wrote, "A self can never exist outside a matrix of relationships." Therefore, for Kohut, autonomy is not possible because we can never move past the attachment of relationships. According to James Jones, for Freud, transference is outgrown. For Kohut, we move from childish to adult forms. The self and its relationships are one. Further, John Bowlby, through his decades of research into human attachment, writes that our fundamental need is for a secure base. Perhaps viewing this secure base as God, Anna Marie Rizzuto writes, quote, "The sense of self is in fact in a dialectic interaction with a God representation that has become essential to the maintenance of the sense of being oneself." William Meisner, a Roman Catholic psychoanalyst, wrote to inextricably bind psychoanalysis with religious faith and dialogue, and said, just as there are neurotic reasons for believing in God, there are also neurotic reasons to refuse belief in God. Finally, Christopher Bolus, a psychoanalyst from the United States and later England, viewed us as homo religios, or inherently religious. Psychoanalysis, in its relational emphasis, has brought us to concern for our dependency on each other and of God's grace and love. This remark brings to mind an important dialect for psychoanalysis and theology when Nikolaos Ludovicos remarks, "The phenomenon of the unconscious is seen to constitute the field of intersubjective quest for meaning, which leads to an eschatological capability of self-recreating and giving content and meaning to the human self with an ascesis of communion, which allows him to isolate the fundamental relational structure which makes him up as a being. The unconscious, thus, is no longer sort of a mythical being at the very periphery of the subject, but rather a real, given, and alive entity actively meeting with the consciousness in the other in the light of which it's interpreted. Psychoanalysis is thus raised to the point of being theological, precisely through which this eschatological opening in relationship to the subject, an eschatological stance which incorporates a series of fundamental biblical anthropological givens. In conclusion, in James Jones' Psychoanalysis of Religion, he writes that religion would be defined not primarily as a defense against instincts or a manifestation of internalized objects, but rather as a relationship with God, and the psychoanalytic study of religion would investigate the way which individuals' religious beliefs, experiences, and practices reflect the dynamics active in their construing of experience and the deep structure of their internalized relationships. Clearly, religious experience is influenced by our attachment experiences and fundamental pattern of object relations. Rizzuto theorizes that just as the idea of God is developmentally necessary to ground our earliest awareness of the existence of things, perhaps a God is needed to ground our sense of who we are. Thus, the child who feels secure grounds that security in a caring God. The child who feels guilty and terrible grounds that sense of self by referring it to a wrathful God. The child who feels estranged envisions a distant deity or dreams of a compensatory, warm, and tender God. This discussion began with Freud and early psychoanalysis obtrusion with religion. Further analysis of Freud's early history throws into question his atheism and characterization of religion as a childish obsessional neurosis are to be taken as psychoanalytic truth. When humans confuse subjective truth for objective truth or cannot bridge the two as such through transitional relating, a fissure in relating and understanding may result. Freud's theoretical problem at least appears to have stemmed from his relationships, especially when he could not be the authority. While his famed self-analysis was admirable and a great contribution to psychoanalysis, Freud apparently mounted a massive defense against the unbearably terrifying and painful losses of those he needed. Perhaps recognizing and needing God was inconceivable for him. Preferring to go it alone, he tried to create a scientific discipline that would provide a cure that he so desperately seemed to need himself. This cure might have helped him come to terms with the relatively helpless but life-giving need for others, which in turn could have brought him back to God, though the undeniable but healthy and more mature need from dependence, through the healthy and undeniable need for dependence. This is healthy, adult, mature dependence. On the other hand, we must question whether psychoanalysis would have been developed, at least how it did, were it not for Freud's particular manner of achievement and struggles. This, you can see, is the double-edged sword. Learning from Freud's example and some of the revisions that were later to be made in psychoanalytic theorizing has contributed to the maintenance and improvement of this dialogue with religion and holds significant potential for authentic participation in one's faith. Psychoanalysis can be enriched by acknowledging the ontological foundations of the human psyche, while psychoanalysis may encourage authenticity, which should enhance religious faith to the mutual benefit of both.